tiny hands trembled as they placed the golden circlet upon her head. She was just 10 years old, barely tall enough to see over the altar where moments before, priests had blessed her husband's coffin. Isabella of Valois stood in Westminster Abbey, no longer a child bride, but England's youngest widow, and now its forgotten queen. This is the story most history books skip over, buried beneath the grand narratives of kings and conquests. Isabella's tale reveals one of medieval Europe's darkest truths: how royal children became pawns in a deadly game of politics, their lives sacrificed before they'd even begun. In 1396, when most children were learning to read, Isabella was learning to rule a foreign kingdom. Her story isn't just about medieval marriage customs. It's about survival, resilience, and what happens when a little girl is thrust into the center of two warring nations' ambitions. Our story begins not with Isabella, but with two kings desperate to end a war that had already consumed 3 generations. The year was 1396, and England and France had been locked in what we now call the 100 Years' War for nearly 6 decades. King Richard II of England was just 29, but he'd already seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes. Across the Channel, King Charles VI of France was battling his own demons, literally. He suffered from what historians believe was schizophrenia, experiencing violent episodes where he didn't recognize his own family. Both kingdoms were exhausted, their treasuries were empty, their people starving, their armies decimated. Something had to give, and that something became a 6-year-old girl named Isabella. Isabella of Valois was born into French royalty in 1389, the daughter of the mad King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. Even as a toddler, she would have understood her role. Royal children weren't raised to follow their hearts, but to serve their kingdom's needs. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The peace negotiations between England and France hinged on a marriage alliance. Richard II needed a wife who could bring legitimacy and end the war. Charles VI needed to secure his daughter's future and France's safety. The solution seemed obvious to medieval minds. Marry the 29-year-old English king to the 6-year-old French princess. To us, this sounds monstrous. But in 1396, child marriage among royalty was common practice. These weren't romantic unions, they were business contracts written in human lives. The marriage wouldn't be consummated until Isabella reached puberty, but the political bond would be immediate and unbreakable. The wedding preparations began with all the pageantry befitting a royal alliance. Isabella's trousseau included golden crowns, silk gowns in the English style, and a collection of dolls, because despite her new title, she was still a child who played with toys. French craftsmen spent months creating a miniature throne for her coronation, while English seamstresses worked day and night on robes that would need to be taken up significantly to fit her tiny frame. On October 31, 1396, Isabella stood at the altar of St. Nicholas Church in Calais. She wore a dress of cloth of gold that pooled around her feet, and a crown that had to be padded with silk to keep it from slipping over her eyes. Beside her stood Richard II, a man old enough to be her father, wearing the solemn expression of someone performing a duty rather than celebrating love. The ceremony itself was brief. Isabella probably didn't understand the Latin words being spoken over her head, but she would have grasped their weight from the faces around her, the relief of the French delegation, the calculating satisfaction of the English nobles, the tears of her own nursemaids, who knew they might never see her again. After the wedding, Isabella traveled to England, leaving behind everything familiar. The journey across the Channel would have been her first time at sea, probably terrifying for a child so young. When she arrived at the English court, she found herself in a world of strangers speaking a foreign language, surrounded by customs she didn't understand. Richard II, to his credit, seemed to genuinely care for his child bride. Contemporary accounts describe him treating her with kindness, almost like a beloved niece rather than a wife. He ensured she had French-speaking companions, allowed her to keep her dolls, and never pressured her into adult responsibilities she wasn't ready for. Isabella had her own household, her own servants, and the finest tutors money could buy. But kindness couldn't shield her from the political storm gathering around them. Richard II was not a popular king. His nobles found him weak, his people found him disconnected, and his enemies found him vulnerable. The same barons who had negotiated Isabella's marriage were already whispering about replacing her husband. Isabella spent 4 years in this strange limbo, married but not really married, queen but not really queen, child but not allowed to be childish. She learned English, absorbed court protocol, and slowly began to understand the precarious position she occupied. Her marriage was the thread holding together a fragile peace, and everyone knew it. Then came 1399. The year that changed everything. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, returned from exile with an army and a claim to the throne. What followed was less a battle than a collapse. Richard's support evaporated overnight, and by September, he was a prisoner in his own castle. For Isabella, now 10 years old, the coup meant immediate danger. She was no longer just a child queen. She was evidence of the old regime, a living reminder of alliances that the new king might want to forget. Henry IV, as Bolingbroke now called himself, had to decide what to do with a French princess whose very existence complicated his claim to legitimacy. The months that followed were the darkest of Isabella's young life. Richard II, her protector and the only stability she'd known in England, was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. There, in February 1400, he died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause was starvation, but most historians believe he was murdered on Henry IV's orders. At 10 years old, Isabella was now a widow. The man who had shown her kindness, who had tried to shield her from the harsh realities of political marriage, was gone. She stood in Westminster Abbey for his funeral, wearing black mourning clothes that had to be hastily altered to fit her small frame. The crown that had once seemed too large for her head now felt impossibly heavy. Henry IV faced a dilemma. Isabella was still valuable as a diplomatic asset, but she was also dangerous, a potential rallying point for Richard's supporters and a living reminder of his predecessor's legitimacy. The new king tried to arrange another marriage for her, proposing his own son, the future Henry V, as her next husband. But Isabella, despite her youth, had learned to recognize the patterns of royal politics. She had watched one husband die for a crown, and she refused to watch another. In a move that shocked the court, she rejected the proposal outright. This 10-year-old girl, who had been married off at 6 and widowed at 10, found the courage to say no. Her refusal created a diplomatic crisis. The French demanded her return, the English wanted to keep her as leverage, and Isabella herself had become an unwilling player in international politics. For months, negotiations dragged on while she remained in England, technically a queen dowager, but practically a prisoner. Finally, in 1401, after nearly 2 years of negotiations, Isabella was allowed to return to France. She crossed the Channel again, but this time as a survivor rather than a pawn. The frightened 6-year-old who had left France was returning as a young woman who had stared down kings and lived to tell about it. Back in France, Isabella tried to reclaim what remained of her childhood. She was barely 11, but she had already lived through more political upheaval than most adults experience in a lifetime. The French court welcomed her home, but she was no longer the innocent child who had left 5 years earlier. She had been shaped by tragedy, hardened by loss, and educated in the harsh realities of power. Isabella would go on to marry again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orleans, in a union that was her choice rather than her burden. She lived to see her children grow up, something that had seemed impossible during those dark years in England. But the scars of her early experiences never fully healed. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies have always used children as instruments of adult ambition. Isabella's marriage at 6 wasn't an aberration. It was standard practice for royal families who saw their children as assets to be deployed rather than people to be protected. What makes Isabella remarkable isn't just what happened to her, but how she responded. When given the chance to refuse another political marriage, she took it. When offered the opportunity to become a pawn again, she chose to be a player instead. At 10 years old, she found the strength to say no to a king. Today, we look back at Isabella's story and see the evolution of childhood itself, how we've slowly learned to value children's well-being over political convenience. But we also see echoes of her struggle in modern debates about children's rights, forced marriage, and the protection of vulnerable young people. Isabella of Valois died in 1409, just 19 years old. History barely remembers her name, but her story deserves to be told. She reminds us that behind every political alliance, every treaty, every royal marriage, there were real people, often children, whose lives were forever changed by decisions they had no power to make. If you found Isabella's story as compelling as we did, hit subscribe for more forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered.